In Chicago's criminal underworld, marriage doesn't start with "I do." It starts with a loaded gun to the head. For decades, the Donovans and the Barzinis have painted the streets red with each other's blood. But when the city began to burn, a peace treaty was written in a marriage license. Adrian Donovan, the ruthless heir to a kingdom of silence, was forced to marry his greatest enemy, Isabella Barzini. It was supposed to be a strategic merger, a way to stop the war. But on the day of their wedding, the chapel went up in flames. A warning message changed everything, and the peace ignited the deadliest mafia war the city had ever seen. By the time the smoke clears, empires will fall, brothers will betray brothers, and two enemies will have to decide if they'll die by each other's hands or rule the world together. Because in this game, trust is a luxury, and betrayal is the only thing that's guaranteed. The air inside the St. Jude Chapel was thick, not with incense, but with a suffocating medicinal layer of tension. Adrian Donovan stood at the altar, his silhouette as rigid as the industrial steel that built his family's empire. Beside him, Isabella Barzini was a vision of tragic defiance, her white lace veil fluttering against a face that held no warmth, only a cold, smoldering fury. This wasn't a union of souls. It was a desperate merger of two predatory dynasties forced together by the looming shadow of a Russian takeover. The priest's voice droned on, a hollow ritual for a crowd that carried suppressed weapons under their silk tuxedo jackets. Adrian's surgical eyes didn't move from the crucifix, his mind already calculating the next phase of the peace treaty. He viewed Isabella as a volatile asset to be managed, a beautiful disruption to his perfect order. Isabella, however, stared straight ahead with tears of pure betrayal streaking her cheeks, not for a lost love, but for the freedom she was being traded for. As Adrian reached out to slide a heavy golden band onto her finger, a sharp chime cut through the silence. Isabella's hand trembled as she glanced at the smartphone clutched against her bouquet. The screen glowed with a jagged urgency. "Don't trust him." Her breath hitched, her eyes darting to Adrian, whose face remained an unreadable mask of stone. The question of trust died before it could be asked. A deafening roar suddenly tore through the chapel's foundation, shattering the stained glass into a million shards of colored light. The floor buckled as a massive explosion at the rear of the church sent a wave of heat and debris screaming toward the altar. In an instant, the sanctuary was transformed into a furnace of orange fire and black smoke. Adrian didn't hesitate. He lunged, his no-emotion rule momentarily fractured as he tackled Isabella to the marble floor just as a burning beam crashed where they had stood seconds before. Amidst the screams of the dying and the smell of cordite, the peace treaty didn't just break, it vaporized. The war hadn't been stopped by this marriage. It had simply been given a front-row seat. As Adrian pulled a concealed pistol from his waistband, Isabella pushed him away, her eyes wild with a realization that went deeper than the fire. The message was right. The war was here, and her husband was her first suspect. The transition from the burning chapel to the Donovan estate felt less like a homecoming and more like a transfer between high-security prisons. As the heavy oak doors of the silent mansion swung shut, the crackling of the fire was replaced by a sterile, suffocating quiet. Adrian Donovan didn't offer a tour. He simply gestured toward the grand staircase with the same clinical detachment he used to sign death warrants. To him, Isabella Barzini was no longer a rival to be hunted, but an asset to be managed, a piece of the Donovan Syndicate's expanding inventory. But Isabella hadn't come to be a silent ornament in his gallery of power. While Adrian retreated to his study to manage the fallout of the wedding hit, Isabella began her psychological siege. She didn't use bullets. She used the sharp edges of her defiance to chip away at his perfect order. By the second morning, the meticulous silence of the mansion was broken. She rearranged his high-stakes files, replaced his classical records with the chaotic sounds of the city, and sat at the head of the mahogany dining table, a seat reserved for the Don himself. When Adrian finally emerged, His mask of cold fury was momentarily shaken. He found her draped across a velvet armchair, nursing a glass of his most expensive scotch, her eyes challenging him to reassert the control he so desperately craved. "You think these walls make me your subject?" she asked, her voice a low, dangerous purr that cut through his surgical detachment. Adrian remained standing, his hands clenched at his sides, realizing for the first time that his new wife was not a victim of this forced merger. She was a disruptor. Every time he attempted to dictate the rules of her new life, she dismantled them with a mocking smile or a strategic interference in his communications. She was testing the structural integrity of his empire from the inside out. The tension in the hallways became a physical weight, a domestic war where every shared meal was a battlefield and every silence was a loaded weapon. Adrian wanted an empire of silence, but Isabella was bringing the roar of the Barzini streets into his very bedroom. As they stood in the dimly lit foyer, the air thick with mutual loathing and an unexpected, rising respect, Adrian realized his greatest mistake. He had brought his enemy into his home, thinking he could cage her, but the cage was already beginning to melt. The cold tension inside the Donovan estate was thick enough to choke the flickering candlelight. Adrian stood by the arched window of his study, his silhouette as rigid and unyielding as the empire he fought to maintain. He watched the rain lash against the glass, reflecting the chaos of the chapel that still smelled of smoke on his skin. Behind him, Isabella sat in a velvet armchair, her white wedding veil now discarded like a surrendered flag. The silence between them wasn't peace, it was a tactical intermission. Isabella broke the quiet first, her voice a sharp blade in the dark. She pulled the smartphone from her silk robes, the screen illuminating the dried tear tracks on her cheeks. "They told me you were the one who set the fire, Adrian," she whispered, the fear in her eyes replaced by a simmering, vengeful heat. She slid the phone across the mahogany desk. The glowing white background and bold black text were unmistakable. "Don't trust him." Adrian didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his inner suit pocket and pulled out his own device, placing it perfectly parallel to hers. On his screen, a message from an encrypted source mirrored her own. "She is the assassin. Finish her before the vows." For a moment, the heir left the room. The two heirs, forced into a union by their fathers to stop a massacre, realized they were both being played like pawns in a much larger game. Adrian's surgical detachment wavered as he looked at the cracked golden ring sitting between them on the desk. He had spent his life treating people like assets, but Isabella wasn't an asset, she was a mirror. "My father told me this marriage would save the Barzini name," Isabella said, her lip curling in a mix of realization and disgust. "But someone wanted us dead before we even left the altar." Adrian stepped closer, his shadow falling over her. He realized then that if he didn't earn her genuine trust, they would both be dead before the week was out. The warning wasn't just a text, it was a declaration of war from inside their own bloodlines. In the heart of the Donovan mansion, the domestic war shifted into a terrifying alliance of necessity. They were no longer just enemies. They were the only two people in Chicago who knew the truth. The silence of the Donovan estate was never peaceful. It was a heavy, tactical quiet that Adrian curated like a weapon. But tonight, that silence was shattered by a sound that made his blood turn to ice, the rhythmic, electronic chime of a high-priority security breach. On the monitors, the grainy thermal feed of the family's secondary safe house flickered and died. Elena Donovan, the younger sister who Adrian had spent his entire life shielding from the filth of the streets, had been the only person he believed was safe from the fallout of his blood-stained marriage. He was wrong. While Adrian and Isabella were locked in their psychological Cold War within the mansion's walls, a shadow had moved across the city. The Volkov Bratva, sensing the fractured state of Chicago's two greatest empires, had stopped waiting for an invitation to the war. They had struck at the Donovan heart. In the outskirts of the city, the safe house door didn't just open, it was erased by a breaching charge. Alina had barely reached for the small pistol Adrian had forced her to carry before a massive hand clamped over her mouth. Her captor was Mikhail Volkov, a man whose reputation for brutal efficiency was a legend whispered in the darker corners of the shipping ports. He didn't speak. He didn't hesitate. He looked at the girl, calm, terrified, but refusing to scream, and threw her over his shoulder like a prize won in a raid. Back at the estate, Isabella watched Adrian's face shift from surgical detachment to a raw, jagged fury she had never seen before. The "don't trust him" message still burned in the back of her mind, but as Adrian's hand crushed the glass he was holding, she realized the game had changed. "They took her," Adrian whispered, the words sounding like a death sentence. "The Russians?" Isabella asked, her voice sharp and calculating. "Volkov," Adrian replied, finally looking at his enemy bride. For the first time, he didn't see an asset or a rival. He saw the only person in Chicago who hated the Russians as much as he did. The Bratva hadn't just kidnapped a girl. They had provided the one thing that could unite two predators. As the first report of the Volkov strike hit the Underworld wires, the city held its breath. The Donovan Syndicate and the Barzini Empire were supposed to be at each other's throats, but as Adrian reached for his tactical gear, Isabella didn't move to stop him. She reached for her own. The war for Chicago had officially expanded, and Adrian Donovan was the spark that would turn the Cold War into an inferno. Deep in the reinforced concrete belly of a Volkov safe house, the air was thick with the scent of damp stone and expensive tobacco. Adrian Donovan sat on the edge of a bolted-down cot, her posture as straight and regal as if she were still sitting at her family's mahogany dining table in the Heights. She didn't flinch when the heavy steel door groaned open, revealing the towering silhouette of Mikhail Volkov. Mikhail was a man carved from the jagged ice of the Siberian tundra, the Bratva's most lethal enforcer, and a man whose reputation for brutal efficiency made even the Donovans speak his name in hushed tones. He set a tray of food down on the small wooden table, his movements precise and predatory. He expected tears, or perhaps the frantic bargaining of a girl who knew her life was a bargaining chip in a citywide war. Instead, he met a gaze that was disturbingly calm. "You haven't touched the water," Mikhail noted, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that vibrated in the small room. "I prefer to know who is serving me before I accept their hospitality," Alina replied, her voice steady. She watched him closely, noting the tension in his massive shoulders and the way his hand lingered near the holster at his hip. "You're Mikhail, the man they call the Winter Wolf." Mikhail paused, a flicker of something curiosity perhaps crossing his cold features. No victim had ever looked him in the eye and used his name. "Names don't matter here, little dove. You are a prisoner of the Bratva, nothing more. And you are a soldier following orders you know are beneath you," she countered softly. She stood up, moving toward him with a grace that made him instinctively tighten his grip on the door handle. "My brother is coming for me, Mikhail, and when he does, the only thing that will decide if you live or die is how you treated me in the dark." For the first time in his career, Mikhail felt a crack in his absolute loyalty. He had guarded hundreds of captives, but Alina wasn't a victim. She was a mirror. She didn't see a monster. She saw a man bound by his own golden chains. As the days bled into each other, the silence between them stopped being a battle and started becoming a sanctuary. Mikhail found himself lingering in the room longer than his duties required, drawn to her quiet strength. It was a dangerous bond, a captive heart and a silent guardian, both caught in the crosshairs of a war that Adrian Donovan was already beginning to unleash. In the shadows of the Bratva, a new loyalty was quietly taking root, one that threatened to burn more than just Chicago. The rain slicked the jagged asphalt of the Chicago shipping docks, reflecting the flickering neon of the Volkov territory. Adrian stood in the shadows of a rusted freight container, his movements as cold and calculated as the high-caliber rifle in his grip. Beside him, Isabella adjusted the silencer on her own weapon, her white wedding veil long replaced by tactical black, though the embers of their ruined ceremony still seemed to burn in her eyes. They were here for Alina, but the air between them was thick with a different kind of tension, a residue of the "don't trust him" warning that still haunted Isabella's thoughts. "2 guards at the north gate, 3 on the catwalk," Adrian whispered, his voice a low, surgical rasp. "I take the high ground, you breach. If you slip up, the peace treaty ends tonight." Isabella didn't flinch. She leaned in, her face inches from his. "Don't worry about my slip-ups, Adrian. Just make sure your calculated silence doesn't miss the heart." The raid began with a rhythmic, deadly precision. As Isabella moved through the warehouse like a phantom, her rebellious streak transformed into a terrifyingly sharp efficiency. She didn't just fight, she disrupted, flushing the Russian enforcers out of the shadows and directly into Adrian's line of sight. From the rafters, Adrian watched her work. He had spent his life treating people like assets, but watching Isabella dismantle a Volkov security detail wasn't a business transaction. It was art. When a Russian enforcer lunged at Isabella from a blind spot, Adrian's shot rang out before she could even turn, the bullet grazing her shoulder to find its mark in the attacker's chest. In that moment, the surgical detachment he prized so highly flickered. He wasn't just protecting a political investment, he was protecting his equal. Back to back in the center of the warehouse, surrounded by the fallen, the 2 rivals felt the shift. The adrenaline of the hunt had done what the altar could not. It bridged the gap between enemies. Their breathing was synchronized, their trust forced by the necessity of survival. Adrian looked at Isabella, seeing not just a Barzini, but a partner who possessed the fire his own empire lacked. The mission to save Alina was far from over, but as they stood amidst the wreckage of the Volkov's first line of defense, they realized a terrifying truth. Together, they weren't just a marriage of convenience. They were a weapon of mass destruction. Luca Barzini was a storm that Chicago's underworld had learned to fear. While his brother Marco calculated and his sister Isabella defied, Luca simply destroyed. He was the youngest, the most aggressive, and the most unpredictable weapon in the Barzini arsenal, a man who lived for the adrenaline of a fight where survivors were a rarity. But as the city-wide tension between the Donovans and the Russians reached a boiling point, Luca found himself in an unfamiliar state of silence. It happened in a small, tucked-away kitchen far from the mahogany offices of crime lords. Sofia Navarro didn't know the man standing at her counter was a monster. To her, he was just a customer with eyes that looked like they had seen too much. She was a talented chef, building a life out of flour and spices, miles away from the Mafia's reach. When she spoke to him, it wasn't with the trembling fear Luca was used to. It was with a grounded, calming warmth that momentarily silenced the roar of violence in his head. For the first time, Luca felt the weight of his own reputation. Sofia's influence was a quiet gravity, pulling him toward a world where power didn't require a trigger pull. He found himself returning to her restaurant not for information, but for the peace her presence provided. Yet, the darkness of the Barzini name was never far behind. One night, the 2 worlds collided with brutal clarity. Sofia stepped into the alleyway at the wrong moment, witnessing a transaction that stripped away Luca's civilian mask. The shock on her face was more painful to him than any blade. As his associates moved to eliminate the witness, Luca stood at a crossroads he had never faced. He was a man who lived by the rule of the bullet, but as he looked at Sofia, the aggression that defined him flickered and died. For the first time in his life, Luca Barzini didn't choose to destroy. He chose to protect. He stepped between his men and the woman who had shown him a glimpse of peace, realizing that by saving her, he was declaring a new kind of war against his own nature. While the streets of Chicago bled under the open warfare of the Donovans and the Barzinis, Marco Barzini moved through the shadows of the empire with the surgical precision of a ghost. Unlike his brother Luca, who favored the loud crack of gunfire, Marco dealt in the silent currency of information. He was the strategist, the middle brother who saw the board 3 moves ahead, but even he hadn't anticipated the storm following Alina Vasquez. Alina was a phantom in a silk dress, appearing in the most exclusive corners of the criminal underworld with secrets that could melt titanium. For weeks, Marco had tracked her, drawn to her intelligence and the dangerous elegance she moved with. But as he sat across from her in a dimly lit corner of a Barzini-owned lounge, the digital files he had decrypted began to tell a story far more terrifying than a simple power grab. "You're playing a dangerous game, Alina," Marco murmured, his voice as smooth as the bourbon in his glass. He slid a tablet across the table, the screen glowing with financial ledgers that shouldn't exist, back-channel payments linking the Barzini old guard to the very Russian Bratva they were supposed to be fighting. Alina didn't flinch. She leaned in, the scent of her perfume masking the metallic tang of the city's tension. "The game was rigged before we even sat down, Marco," she whispered. "Your father didn't just broker a marriage between Adrian and Isabella to stop a war. He did it to gather everyone in one room so the Russians could finish you all off at once." The revelation hit Marco with the force of a physical blow. The wedding fire hadn't been a Russian ambush. It was an inside job. The conspiracy was deeper than Chicago. It was a global restructuring of power where his own blood was willing to trade his life for a seat at a larger table. Alina Vasquez wasn't just a mysterious woman. She was a whistleblower from the inside of a conspiracy much bigger than the city itself. As the realization settled, Marco knew the fragile alliance between Adrian and Isabella was the only thing standing between them and total annihilation. He looked at Alina, seeing the weight of the secrets she carried, and realized that his calm, calculating nature was about to be dragged into a chaos he couldn't control. The old guard was preparing to burn the world down, and Marco had just found the match. While Adrian Donovan was busy playing the hero for a Barzini bride, the real rot was festering inside the Donovan Syndicate's own walls. Valentina Donovan didn't believe in peace treaties or blood-bound alliances. To her, Adrian's forced marriage wasn't a strategic masterstroke. It was a surrender of the Donovan legacy to a woman who should have been in a shallow grave. Standing in a dimly lit cigar lounge that smelled of expensive tobacco and betrayal, Valentina looked across the table at Victor Kane, a man whose reputation for brutality made even the Donovan enforcers look like choir boys. "Adrian is distracted," Valentina said, her voice as sharp as a stiletto. "He thinks he's building a dynasty with Isabella, but he's really just building a target." Victor Kane leaned forward, the firelight catching the cold hunger in his eyes. He didn't just want a seat at the table. He wanted to own the table, the room, and everyone in it. Their partnership was a marriage of convenience far deadlier than the one at the altar. Valentina wanted the Donovan throne, and Victor wanted the raw power that came with her name. They both knew the syndicate was built on the illusion of absolute unemotional control, the very flaw that was currently blinding Adrian. "If the Russian rescue mission fails," Victor rasped, his hand hovering over a map of Chicago's shipping ports, "the syndicate will look for a leader who doesn't let a Barzini girl pull his strings." Valentina smiled, a cold, calculated expression that mirrored the cousin she intended to replace. She wasn't looking for protection, she was looking for authority. As they finalized their secret deal, the stakes were clear. One slip-up meant a bullet from Adrian's cold-blooded tactical teams. But Valentina was tired of living in the shadows of a man she deemed weak for his newfound loyalty. While Adrian and Isabella fought back-to-back against the Russians, Valentina was sharpening the blade for their own backs. The war for Chicago was no longer just between families. It was a civil war for the soul of the syndicate itself. The atmosphere in Chicago didn't just chill when Salvatore Barzini's private jet touched down. It froze. Adrian Donovan felt the shift in the city's pulse before his security detail even confirmed the news. For weeks, Adrian and Isabella had been operating in a delicate, high-stakes dance, slowly stitching together the frayed edges of their two empires. But Salvatore, the eldest Barzini brother and the true, undisputed king of the underworld, wasn't interested in a shared throne. He ruled through raw intimidation, and to him, This forced marriage was a sign of his family's softening. Salvatore didn't send a message or call a meeting. He made his presence known by fire. Within 3 hours of his return, 2 of Adrian's primary shipping warehouses were reduced to smoldering husks, and 3 of the Donovan Syndicate's top lieutenants were found silenced in the very streets they were supposed to protect. Salvatore wasn't just reclaiming his territory. He was purging anything that smelled of compromise. Inside the Donovan estate, the air was thick with the scent of expensive bourbon and impending violence. Adrian stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his face a mask of surgical detachment, though the tightening of his jaw betrayed the pressure. Behind him, Isabella paced like a caged predator, her white silk robe a sharp contrast to the dark bruising on her knuckles from a recent training session. "My brother doesn't do alliances, Adrian," she spat, her voice laced with a mixture of fear and fury. "Salvatore sees this marriage as a surrender. He's not here to talk. He's here to remind everyone why even the rival bosses fear crossing a Barzini." Adrian turned, his eyes locking onto hers with a cold, focused intensity. His flaw had always been treating people as assets, but Salvatore was an apex predator who couldn't be quantified on a ledger. The king's wrath was a direct threat to the fragile trust they had begun to build. If Salvatore succeeded in reclaiming control by force, the blood pact would be nothing more than a footnote in a history written in their blood. The front gates of the estate groaned as a fleet of black SUVs tore through the perimeter. Salvatore didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped out into the rain-slicked driveway, his presence commanding a terrifying silence from both Donovan and Barzini guards. He looked up at the window where the new power couple stood, his eyes promising a war that would make the previous decades look like a skirmish. The king was back, and he was ready to burn the new dynasty before it could even take its first breath. The rain in Chicago didn't wash away the blood. It only made the scent of iron and gunpowder linger in the air as Adrian and Isabella navigated the maze of a derelict shipping yard. They were hunting the mole who had leaked their location to the Volkovs, but the hunter quickly became the prey. A sudden flash of muzzle fire erupted from the catwalks above, the bullets shredding the steel crates around them with deafening precision. "Down!" Adrian roared, his cold, calculated mask slipping for the first time as he lunged toward Isabella. He didn't just shove her, he shielded her body with his own, his heavy tactical coat absorbing the spray of gravel and debris as they hit the wet concrete. Isabella, always the disruptor who mocked his authority, found herself pinned beneath the man she had sworn to hate, feeling the frantic thrum of a heart he claimed didn't exist. As a second volley of gunfire rained down, a ricochet grazed Adrian's shoulder. He didn't flinch or cry out. He simply shifted his weight to ensure Isabella remained entirely covered, his eyes scanning the darkness with a lethal, protective focus. For the first time, Isabella saw past the ruthless heir of the Donovan Syndicate and witnessed the man who put family, even an enemy wife, above his own survival. The air was thick with the smell of wet pavement and ozone. "I don't need your protection, Donovan," she hissed, though her voice lacked its usual bite as she watched blood begin to seep through his dark suit. "Today you do," Adrian replied, his voice a low, jagged rasp. He reached out, his hand steady despite the wound, and pulled his suppressed pistol. "When I move, you run for the SUV. Don't look back." In that narrow space between life and death, the tectonic plates of their relationship shifted. Isabella didn't see a captor or a rival, she saw a partner. The hatred that had fueled her sabotage for weeks began to harden into something far more dangerous, a fierce, budding loyalty. As Adrian stood to draw the enemy's fire, allowing her the path to escape, the war between them ended and the war for Chicago truly began. The rain lashed against the windows of the safe house, a rhythmic drumbeat that mirrored the pounding in Adrian's chest. He sat across from Isabella, the flickering candlelight casting long, jagged shadows against the peeling wallpaper. In his hand, he held a decrypted ledger recovered from the Donovan vault, a collection of dates and wire transfers that shouldn't have existed. Isabella watched him, her eyes sharp and wary, the tear stains from their wedding day long gone, replaced by a cold, hardened resolve. "Look at the time stamp, Isabella," Adrian said, his voice a low rasp that barely carried over the storm. He slid the ledger toward her. "The payment for the explosives at the chapel. It wasn't sent from a Russian offshore account. It was routed through a Donovan shell company 3 days before we even signed the pact." Isabella's breath hitched as she scanned the lines of code. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from a burgeoning, incandescent rage. "And here," she whispered, pointing to a mirrored entry, "a matching authorization from the Barzini shipping ports. My father didn't just know about the hit, he co-signed it." The silence that followed was suffocating. For decades, they had been raised to believe their families were two sides of an inevitable war, held together only by the blood pact of their marriage. But the truth was far more sinister. Their fathers, the old guard, hadn't sought peace, they had sought a clean slate. By orchestrating an explosion that was supposed to kill both heirs at the altar, the Dons could have blamed the tragedy on the Russians, ignited a war they controlled, and maintained their grip on Chicago without the threat of a younger generation taking the throne. Adrian looked at the woman he was forced to marry, the woman he had been taught to hate since birth. In her eyes, he saw the same shattering realization. They weren't just pawns, they were sacrifices. His surgical detachment, the flaw that had always kept him isolated, finally cracked. He realized that the only person in the world who understood this betrayal was the enemy sitting across from him. "They wanted us to burn so they could keep the ashes," Adrian said, his gaze locking onto hers with a new, terrifying clarity. Isabella stood up, the light of the fire reflecting in her dark eyes. "Then let's give them a real fire, Adrian, one they can't control." In that moment, the forced marriage died, and a lethal partnership was born. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were the architects of a new, unified vengeance. The sky over Chicago bled a bruised purple as the fragile peace finally disintegrated into a symphony of gunfire and shattered glass. This was no longer a shadow war fought in back alleys. It was a scorched earth siege for the soul of the city. From the high-rises of the Loop to the industrial docks of the South Side, the Donovan Syndicate, the Barzini Empire, and the Volkov Bratva collided in a three-way massacre that turned the streets into a graveyard of ambition. Adrian Donovan stood in the command center of his reinforced estate, his face a mask of surgical focus as he watched the digital map of the city light up with red zones. His flaw, that cold, calculating detachment, was now his greatest weapon, but for the first time, his eyes kept flickering to Isabella. She wasn't just a bride or an asset anymore. She was the only person in the room who understood the weight of the crown they were fighting to steal. "The Bratva is moving on the shipping ports," Isabella said, her voice cutting through the static of the radio chatter with a sharpness that matched the blade tucked into her garter. "If they take the docks, they cut off your supply lines and my father's escape route. We have to hit them now." Adrian didn't hesitate. "Prepare the strike teams. We're not defending anymore, we're taking it all." As they moved toward the armored SUVs, the city groaned under the weight of the conflict. Blockades turned residential neighborhoods into war zones, and the air grew heavy with the scent of ozone and spent brass. The old guard, their fathers who had orchestrated the wedding day hit, were nowhere to be found, tucked away in bunkers while the next generation bled for their sins. The siege reached its fever pitch at the Chicago River. Tracers arced across the water like falling stars, reflecting off the dark surface as the Donovan and Barzini soldiers, once sworn enemies, began to move in a lethal, synchronized rhythm. Adrian led the charge, his movements precise and deadly, but he found himself constantly checking Isabella's flank. He had spent his life believing emotions were a liability, yet in the heat of the most violent night of his life, his loyalty to his enemy bride was the only thing keeping him grounded. The Triple Front War was a chaotic blur of betrayal and shifting front lines. Alliances that had lasted decades vanished in a heartbeat as the Volkovs unleashed their full brutality on the docks. But they hadn't accounted for the one thing the fathers hadn't expected. Adrian and Isabella were no longer fighting for their families. They were fighting for themselves. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, the siege wasn't just ending a war. It was clearing the path for a new, unified reign. The air in the Chicago shipping yards tasted of salt, gasoline, and the metallic tang of blood. The Triple Front War had reached its breaking point, and the Donovan-Barzini alliance was screaming toward a violent end. Adrian Donovan moved through the shipping containers with the surgical precision that had made him a legend, his suppressed pistol clicking rhythmically as he cleared the path. For years, he had operated on a single, cold equation. Assets were replaceable, but the empire was eternal. Then he heard the scream. It wasn't the sound of a soldier falling, it was Isabella. He turned to see the Volkov enforcers closing in. Isabella was pinned against a rusted hull, her white wedding dress, now a tattered shroud of gray and crimson, caught in the debris. A Russian sniper's red laser dot danced across her chest, centered perfectly over her heart. Adrian's tactical mind immediately calculated the odds. If he stayed in cover, he could pick off the 3 guards approaching his flank and secure the primary weapon cache, ensuring the Syndicate's victory. If he ran for her, he would be stepping directly into the kill zone of a high-caliber rifle. Logic dictated he let her go. She was his enemy-turned-partner, an asset that had served its purpose. But as his eyes met hers across the chaotic battlefield, the cold mastermind shattered. The surgical detachment he had spent a lifetime perfecting evaporated, replaced by a raw, suffocating terror he hadn't felt since childhood. "Adrian, get back," Isabella shouted, her voice cracking as she struggled to reach her sidearm. He didn't listen. Abandoning the cover of the steel crates, Adrian threw his weapon aside and sprinted into the open. He wasn't thinking about the Syndicate or the Barzini throne. He was thinking about the woman who had mocked his authority and then saved his life in the dark. The sniper's muzzle flashed from the crane above. Adrian didn't flinch. He threw his body over Isabella's just as the first heavy round tore through the air, lead biting deep into his shoulder. The impact threw them both to the oil-slicked ground. Pain exploded in his vision, white-hot and blinding, but he didn't let go. He shielded her with his own weight, his blood soaking into the lace of her veil. "You're a fool," she whispered, her hands shaking as she pressed against his wound to stop the flow. "You just broke your own first rule." Adrian looked down at her, a faint, grim smile breaking through the mask of agony. "Rules are for people who have something to lose," he rasped, his voice thick with the cost of his choice. "I already lost the Empire the moment I realized I couldn't breathe without you." For the first time in the history of the Donovan Syndicate, the boss hadn't made the logical move. He had made the human one. And as the Russian reinforcements closed in, Isabella realized that the man who had once been her greatest enemy had just become the only thing worth fighting for. The smoke over Chicago had finally begun to drift, revealing a city that had been purged by fire and redefined by blood. Adrian Donovan stood on the shattered balcony of the Barzini estate, his dark hair tousled by the wind and his rugged features set in a mask of hard-won victory. Beside him stood Isabella, her white wedding veil long since discarded, replaced by a resolve that mirrored his own. The tears that had once streamed down her face in the burning chapel were gone, replaced by the cold, calculating gaze of a queen who had survived her own executioners. Below them, the old guard lay in the ruins of their own making. The fathers who had brokered a marriage as a death trap were gone, their era of stagnant tradition buried under the weight of a new, unified power. Adrian looked down at his hands, the same hands that had once treated people as mere assets, and realized that his surgical detachment had been his greatest weakness. It wasn't logic that had won the night. It was the moment he abandoned his cold rules to save the woman standing next to him. Isabella reached out, her fingers brushing the large, golden wedding ring that now sat firmly on her hand. It was no longer a symbol of her enemy's cage, but a badge of the most formidable alliance Chicago had ever seen. She looked at Adrian, seeing not the groom she was forced to marry, but the partner she had chosen in the heat of battle. The warning on her phone, "Don't trust him," felt like a lifetime ago, a relic of a world where they were pawns instead of players. "They expected us to destroy each other," Adrian said, his voice a low, commanding rasp that carried across the silent courtyard. "They underestimated what happens when two predators stop fighting for territory and start fighting for a legacy," Isabella replied, her voice steady and sharp. Together, they turned away from the wreckage of the past and walked toward the heavy oak doors of the inner sanctum. The Donovan Syndicate and the Barzini Empire were no more. In their place stood a single, unbreakable dynasty. As the sun began to rise over the skyline, the message to the remaining underworld was clear. The war was over, but their reign had just begun. In the world of the Mafia, power is everything, and Adrian and Isabella now held it all. In the end, Adrian and Isabella learned that the most dangerous lesson of the underworld is this: you don't choose your blood, but you do choose who you bleed for. They were forced into a war, but they chose to end it together, proving that the strongest empire isn't built on fear. It's built on a loyalty that even fire couldn't burn. Chicago has a new legend today, but the shadows are always moving. If you want to see who rises next in our Mafia series, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on post notifications. Like this video if you think Adrian and Isabella are the ultimate power couple, and comment below. Would you have trusted the warning or the man? Share this story with someone who loves high-stakes betrayal. Thanks for watching, and remember, in this world, keep your friends close and your enemies in your sights.